Good afternoon. I'm Gigi Barnhill, President of the Trustees of the Historical Society, and it's great to have you all here this afternoon. Okay, today I think we're going to have a very interesting talk. A House Restored is a meticulous chronicle describing a series of discoveries, materials, techniques, and principles common in the time of the Salem witch trials, but now confined largely to the hands of specialists. As he confronts the cracks, rot, dissolutions, and disconnections of a very old building, our speaker, Lee McColgan, comes to question his motivation. Why restore anything?
Why do we do this to
Why?
ourselves?
Still, with an admirable persistence, he gets his happy ending, and we get an intense primer in the joys and horrors of historic restoration. Of course, this is a question that we've faced at the Historical Society, and we do have a big CPAC grant, I'm pretty sure we'll get through City Council, to do a serious analysis, structural, systems, engineering, roofing, accessible entrance, a whole lot of issues. And so we too are asking these questions. It's a lot of money here. Anyway, Lee has worked on Boston's Old North Church, Louisa May Alcott's Orchard House, and other historical buildings. And his work has been published in Architectural Digest, the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. And lest he forget, I will say that he has copies of his book for sale, and I recommend it highly. So welcome, Lee.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. So my name is Lee McColgan. The book is A House Restored. I'll start with why did I write this book, and there's a few different reasons. So I read widely about traditional building, historic preservation. I found that a lot of the books are either written by architectural historians, which I love, that stuff, it catalogs, kind of all these interesting architectural details that survive. But sometimes those books can be a little dry. I read a lot of books by the builders, the how-tos, the timber framers, the blacksmiths, so on and so forth. I love those books. Not always the best for a general audience unless you're really getting into the trade. So one, I wanted something to hopefully appeal to a more general audience. The idea is if we can get more people excited about historic preservation, draw more attention to this for those that see the value in it, like I do. I'm assuming that I'm preaching to the choir if you're here. If we can get more people excited, engaged, that's how we get people behind these projects, that's how we get funding, and that's what helps us preserve more buildings. Because I'll say this, so this book, it's part, I'm going a different direction with this, but this year I'm going, the Fat Cat, the Wall Street Fat Cat. So the book is part memoir and it's part history, and the main thread is me kind of the tragedies and triumphs, as we say, of restoring this old house. The memoir piece of it is, I was that young kid that loved to build and make stuff, and got older and kind of detoured away and had a long career in the financial service industry, but the desire to make and build and do stuff with my hands just kept tugging at me. So I walked away from a corporate career to get into historic preservation a number of years ago. And I always say, very naively, it's very easy to look at the Wall Street, kind of vilify people get in that world. Any finance people here before I get too far on that? No, okay. Okay, I have to be careful who the audience is. It's easy to vilify people in that industry. You get in that industry for money, and that's not always the case. Plenty of people are in that industry because they want to help people save for retirement. But it can be very easy to vilify the Wall Street professional. It's just the greedy fat cat. Now, when I left that industry and got into historic preservation, I naively thought that everybody in small town New England, Massachusetts was going to appreciate saving their historic architecture, and showing up to do this, we would be viewed as doing noble work, and we were going to have the support of our towns and communities, and everyone would be just cheering us on enthusiastically to save these buildings. And when I started doing this, what did I find out? Is that the case?
No.
So, not so much. So, like anything, there are lots of people that see the value in saving historic architecture. There are a bunch of people that could care less. They can bulldoze an 18th century house and not even think twice. It's old. Is there asbestos in the pipes? Is there mold and mildew? Just get rid of the thing. We'll put some nice new development in there. And and they're different perspectives. So for those of us that see the value in preserving these old buildings, we're faced with this challenge of, well, how do we fight these battles? And we can try to regulate, we can put moratoriums, which is certainly efficient. I think the other way to do that is just to win more hearts and minds. So how do we do that? We have to get people to kind of see our perspective and why we think it matters. So how do you do that? Well, in my case, I said, well, I have lots of my own opinions. I'm not didactic. I'm not meaning to lecture or push my views on people. I wrote the book to say, I think there's value to saving these things. Here's why. And I'm just going to put it out there and hope that if I can win a few more hearts and minds, that just gets more people behind us to help save these buildings. So that's the main genesis of the book. So the story itself, like I said, it's part memoir, it's part history. So in addition to leaving a corporate career to work in the field of historic preservation, my wife and I also bought a 300-year-old house in Pembroke that had been largely untouched for a number of years, and we decided that we wanted to restore this house. So there is this big question with every project of, there's lots of different ways to restore a historic house, right? You watch these HGTV shows or Magnolia, and you see people that come in and find these old houses, and they come in and they gut the things, and they restore they remodel everything, and they make it look new and spruce it up. And that certainly is appropriate in some cases. Sometimes the buildings, if you believe in saving these buildings, sometimes that's the only way to save a building. In my case, though, I really wanted to preserve this much more than remodel the structure. So I didn't have that figured out at first. I kind of dived into this head first and was reading an account. Does anyone read anything from Nathaniel Philbrick?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so In the Heart of the Sea, Mayflower. So one of his more lesser known books, because it was the first book he wrote. I got to meet Nat on Nantucket. I was doing work out there, and that was a real treat. One of his earlier books was called Away Offshore. And there's another reason, another thing I wanted to include in this book. So I was thumbing through this book, and I come across this account that he had put. This was just a local history of Nantucket that he was commissioned to write before he became the big best-selling history author that he's become. It was his first book. And I come across this account that he had found in the library of a builder, an 18th century builder. His name was Richard Macy, and I'm just going to read it. This was written by his grandson. His practice was to bargain to build a house and finish it in every part and find the materials. The stones he collected on the common land, if they were rocks, he would split them. The lime he made by burning shells. The timber he cut here on island. The latter part of his building, when timber was not so easily procured of the right dimensions, he went off island and felled the trees and hewed the lumber to the proper dimensions. The ironwork he generally wrought with his own hands. Thus being prepared, he built the house mostly himself.
Wow.
I was very impressed by this account. Now, for me, reading books can be dangerous. I read these things, I get crazy ideas in my head, and then it leads to the things that I do, which can be off the wall. So this was an example. If I read this and I say, well, that's what I'll do. I'll restore the house. I'll do it myself. There's kind of this idea of self-reliance, and I'm going to learn all of these trades and figure out how to do it like Richard Macy did. There's a second reason that I like to highlight Richard Macy. I'm glad I got to put this guy in a book. Because has anyone heard of Richard Macy before me ever bringing him up? No. The second question is, are there really any in history really famous builders? Who's a famous builder? Yeah, give me one, yeah.
I can't remember the name of this builder, but he wrote a book, and his stable of tools is preserved. Builder's Handbook. I'm sorry.
Asher Benjamin?
Yes, Asher Benjamin.
There we go. So we got
Builder architect.
one, but he's not even famous enough that it's right on the tip of everyone's tongue, right? Like, we know famous architects, Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier,
And Bill Gillen.
Bill Gillen, and Bill. All right. Do you have any comment?
Yeah, so there was a builder of the first church in Lancaster, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
His last name was Freeman. And
Okay.
he wrote a poem. And it's through the poem that he became famous, and then you find that he was
a builder.
He wrote the poem on a shingle.
Yeah. I've jotted many a measurement and note on shingles, by the way. It's a very good common
There were
thing.
at least two in
Something right.
Amherst. Was it William Fenno Pratt, or was he an architect?
Yeah.
Bill Guys.
So there are a few out there,
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
but not many. So I'll shift real quick to this was just, I've had a foot out of the finance world for a long time, but occasionally I keep myself plugged in. And did anyone familiar with Warren Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway? So I don't know if anyone caught Warren Buffett's longtime partner, Charlie Munger, passed away. And he wrote, I read this shareholder letter, which was, this passage was more metaphorical to the company that he built, but I thought there's an interesting point in there. I met Warren Buffett once. That's a story for another day. If you're going to meet Buffett, make sure you're dressed up as Buffett. So he wrote this, in this letter he wrote about the creation of Berkshire Hathaway, the company. So this had nothing to do generally with building the way he was writing, but I read this and I said, I want to point this out. In the physical world, great buildings are linked to their architect, while those who poured the concrete or installed the windows are soon forgotten. And often the case, the history books I read, they're denoted by their trades, their joiners, their carpenters, their wheelwrights, their blacksmiths. We talk a lot about marginalized groups in this day and age. One of the groups that gets glazed over a lot that I don't think gets enough attention is these builders.
Yes.
So, and in searching for their stories, you don't find a lot of, certainly when we get back to the 18th century, you don't find a lot of individual builders' stories. So to come across this account of this guy named Richard Macy, written by his grandson, I thought that was really fascinating to kind of give a name and a face and a story to a builder. Now, that's only a small part of this story. It's really just me following the path of what Richard Macy, trying to do what Richard Macy could do. But I like the idea of giving a builder by name some credit. So I'll just tell you one story from the book. I'll talk a little bit about preservation, then I have a couple of closing remarks, and then I can take questions. And I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the book. So we buy this 300-year-old house. This is what the kitchen looked like when we bought it. It's actually an early 19th century edition off the back. And there's some funny things happening with the framing. If you see this post in the middle, lots of things are covered over in paneling. And I'm thinking that I'm going to just do I'm going to start here. I'm going to try to bring this back to its 18th century glory. We can debate conservation, preservation, restoration. I talk a little bit about that in the book too. But I want to restore this back to its 18th century glory. I'm thinking this is going to be mostly cosmetic. Does it ever work that way? Every building project with an old house costs double what you think or more and takes double the time or more. So I'm going to take this paneling off and figure I can just find the old plaster underneath it to spruce this thing up. So I get my crowbar, pry it under this section of, there's one dubious, it's not in the picture, but there's one dubious corner. So normally, with the timber frame structure, the framing is usually exposed. You can see the large beams running overhead. Sometimes it's encasement, sometimes it's raw. You can see the scallops from the hewing axe. Either way, there's one corner where also the frame is covered over in this dubious bit of veneer paneling from probably the 70s. And that should have raised my eyebrows early on, but I didn't think anything of it. So I go to pry this off, and the panels, you get the feathered end of the crowbar under there, and these panels just start popping off, and the veneer's cracking and popping, and it's kicking up dust. And I pull this section of paneling, it comes off, and what do I find underneath? Now, this is a little further on. Obviously, I've gotten a little further into the restoration project. But the corner of the frame, it's gone. It's dust. It's gone. The whole corner. There was a bit of the post here. I took that out. But the rafter, the wall plate, the tie beam, the post, gone. It's just, none of it's connected anymore. It's dust.
Wow.
And you can take your finger and poke it right through there. So I'm looking at this thing, and I'm thinking, how the heck is this building not falling down on my head? This was a literal, throw the crowbar down, run out to the barn, rummage around for some scrap wood, find some 4x4s, run in and prop them up under this thing and think, whoa, how has this been standing? Now the answer to that, for anyone that's builder knows, is these vertical sheathing boards do a lot more structurally than one might imagine. So a whole corner of your timber frame could be dust, and it can still stay up. But we don't like when our whole corner of our timber frame is dust. So is everyone familiar? I thought I'd talk a little bit about the joinery of a timber frame structure. Everyone familiar with this?
Yeah.
What generally do they call this joint today?
Where does it
Second guess. Anyone else? So they call this the English tying joint. As historians, I don't know what they called it back in the day. You are correct that it's mortise and tenon joinery, but typically when you go in these 17th, 18th, some of the earlier 19th century houses, although timber framing started to die off with the invention of the balloon frame house, you see the big fat, the posts that are really thick on the top and they taper down. And people like to call them gunstock posts. The English called them jowl posts. They come in different styles. They can be truncated. They can be splayed. Sometimes you see fancy bevel work and fancy chamfer stops. Sometimes they're crude. I've seen lots of different variations. But the reason, if you don't know this, the reason that there's that extra material on the top of that beam is it's the convergence of 4 framing members. So there's a wall plate, a tie beam, and a rafter that comes down from above. And yes, it's all tenon in there. So you need this extra material because you've got the plate running parallel to the gable end, or to the eave end of the house. And then you've got, this is a fun one, it's called the teasel tenon. You've got the tie beam that sits on top of that. Generally it's interlocked with, there's a little dovetail cut under here, and it's all interlocked together, and then drawbore and mortise and tenon together and pegged. It's a wonderfully, for wood framing, it is a wonderfully, wonderfully durable way to build a structure. However, when you tear your paneling off of your house, you find that the English tying joint is completely turned into dust. That's a little unsettling. So, there are many of these builder stories out there where Michael Pollan wrote a great one. I've never read A Place of My Own. Nonfiction writer wrote one about building a writer's house. And that story is, you know, I'm the research guy that likes to read and write, but I really shouldn't be swinging a hammer, and I'm going to get into this, and by the end of it, I've become somewhat of a competent builder. My story's the other way around. I was always someone that just naturally was good at making and building things, so I tend to go into things overconfidently. Oh, of course I can do this, and then I get into it and I say, oh crap, I'm over my head. I need some help here. So this was one of those cases, so I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, I want to do all this by myself, I want to kind of follow this path of Richard Macy, but maybe I need a little bit of guidance, and then that's what sets our hero off on his adventure in the story. So I needed to find a modern day timber framer. So where does one come across a modern day timber framer?
Maine.
Did you say Maine?
FBI,
Yeah.
Historic Northampton has them.
They're out there. So I had remembered when I was young going to what's now, it was Plymouth Plantation then, but now it's Plymouth Pawtuxet, so the Living History Museum dedicated to the Pilgrims and the Native Americans down in Plymouth. I had remembered going there as a kid and seeing these crude frame structures, and I said, well, that might be a good place to start. So I hop in the car and I drive down there. Has anyone been there in a long time? Everyone's probably been there before, right? I don't know if anyone's been there recently.
I didn't want to.
Yeah. I don't know what's changed there, but when I went, it was still what I remembered as a kid is costumed interpreters. They're given a character of someone on the Mayflower, and they're told very strictly, you don't break character. And people will come here, and when you talk, so I go there trying to learn about timber framing, and I'm trying to ask logical questions and have a normal modern day conversation, and I can't get anyone to break this character. I'm on the Mayflower, and I don't know anything about, this churning butter, whatever the heck else they're talking about. And it's like, man, can you just talk to me like a human being? Like, I'm trying to get something done here. So finally, after talking, bouncing around, trying to get a couple people, to talk to me to break this character, this woman pulls me aside. She's got the felt hat on and the big dress, the linen dress, and the whole thing. And she pulls me aside, and she's looking over her shoulders. Like, I can't be seen talking to you, but I see your frustration here, so I'm going to talk to you in modern day parlance. So she says the person you need to talk to is a guy named Michael Burry. She says he built a lot of these. He knows everything. That's the guy. So she's got his number. I get a number. I leave there. I call this guy Michael Burry. So Michael Burry now teaches preservation carpentry at the North Bennett Street School in Boston, if everyone's familiar with that. So I track him down, and he happened to be restoring a historic mill on the South Shore in Marshfield, which was very close to where this house is in Pembroke, called the Hatch Mill. And I go find him, and I had been kind of doing this kind of reproduction building stuff for a while as a hobbyist, and I show him some videos I made, some of the work that I do, And it turns out that he is known for taking on an apprentice every summer and had not yet found one. And I said, I'm your person. So I walk away from this corporate career for basically no money. I go to work with eccentric timber framer Michael Burry, and I'm going to learn the art of timber framing. And that's the springboard for the story. So I'll talk a little bit about the repair, and then I'll give you a general overview of the story, and then I'll make a couple more comments, and then I'll stop talking. I can talk a lot. Does anyone ever read the old Eric Sloane books?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So, and there's a great museum in Kent, this Eric Sloane Museum. It's got some of his artwork and a collection of really early American tools. So I had learned a lot of stuff with Michael, cutting mortise and tenons, but sometimes we would just be cleaning the shop, or he salvages lots of old material that's going to go in the dumpster. Sometimes it's just moving this pile so we can get to something that he needs. So true apprentice level work. One of the things I wanted to do, though, back to the really wanting to do this restoration work as in kind as I possibly could, is I wanted to hew the beam. I wanted to hew the beams. I wanted to have the exact same finish as it would have had. I had early thoughts of just felling trees in the backyard. I'm out behind the property thinking, okay, you can go pretty far with this, then you have to start picking your battles. But okay, maybe that's not practical. I end up finding a sawmill that cuts me a square beam, but I have them cut it a little bit wider than what I need, so then I can hew it and make it look appropriate. And I find that's actually common when timber framers do repairs like that. So has anyone hewed a beam before? Probably seen it. Has everyone seen it done before? Mm-hmm. Usually that you see these demonstrations when you go to living history museums or these kinds of places. So I had not actually learned to do that with Michael, so I was going off Eric Sloane's book. And the process, it's fairly straightforward. You need two axes. You need a felling axe and you need a broad axe, which is a little much larger. The felling axe part is tricky because if you look at, so this is what I did. So you look at this person on top of the beam, you're going to climb up on the beam. So now you're off the ground, you're going to balance on the beam. I always think about, whatever the heck, I had nice work boots on. I always think about people doing this stuff when they had just probably flat leather bottom shoes like these things, be sliding all over the place. You hop up on the beam, kind of like you're golfing with a felling axe, and you've got to cut these notches out. What that does is wood is made of cellulose and lignin, long stringy fibers. When you're hewing with the broad axe, what you don't want is the fibers, if there's any wave in the grain, to pull and cut into the wood. So they cut all these notches, joggling it's called, and essentially what that does is it severs the cellulose fibers so you can have just a small section and it won't run away with you, run away on you. So when you hop off and cut it with the broad axe, these little sections will kind of pop off and you just work your way down the line. So that's what they would do. So I get up on this thing and I'm looking down, and what's the unnerving thing about this?
You're swinging an axe with your foot.
Thank you. You're swinging a darn axe right down where your feet are. This does not seem like a good idea. So it's one of the, you have these moments in your life where it's, how did I get here? What am I doing? I lost my mind. So I'm up on the log, and I'm looking at it, I'm sweating a little bit. I lift this thing up like a medieval executioner, like I'm gonna lop off a head, and I gotta commit to this thing, and I bring it down, and it hits and it skips. Woo! Missed me though. But I had this image, flopping off the toe, and there I am, on all hands and knees, crawling around the grass, looking for the bloody digit. I'm thinking, this is crazy. So I take a breather, hop off the log, I take a breather, I calm myself down. I hop back up, swing again, cuts in clean. And then so starts the process. And in the beginning, the cuts aren't super accurate, it's bouncing all over the place. But as you work your way down, it's very repetitive, and you start to get a handle on the technique. And before you know it, you're cutting fairly clean notches. And then you take the broad axe, and you hop off, and you cut the sections off, and you work your way around, and that's how you hew a beam.
How about your knee on that little?
Yeah, okay, two things. One, I've seen some people that do this work, if you go to North Bennet Street School, you see the students do it, sometimes they'll wear full-on hockey shin pads. I've seen that. It's a good idea because there are stories of someone that the axe skips and hits you in the leg to do some damage. If you ever look at an old hewing axe, a broad axe. If you look at if the original handle has survived, or yet someone found the proper reproduction handle, a lot of times the handles have long been changed out. But typically, they kick out. They either curve out like a hockey stick, or they have a real sharp dog leg and flare out. And the reason the handle does that is so as you're standing next to this thing cutting, you're not hitting your knuckles on, it moves your hands over from the arris, from the corner of the wood. So you're not hitting your hands on the wood. Your knees, well, yeah, that's the same risk, but I found that the second part of it seemed to be I've never had any issues with that. That seems to be a lot safer than the first part of it. The control is tricky, and getting it to cut clean lines can be tricky, and not dig in too far. Typically you'll snap a chalk line or something, and that takes a little bit of time. And I don't claim to be the best. I'm very proficient at almost all these trades, but I'll probably, if I have any mastery, I'm probably best as a woodworker, but I don't claim to be the be-all, end-all traditional builder. I've met plenty of traditional builders that are more talented than I am.
How long would it take?
What's that?
How long would it take to do one side?
In the beginning, it took me hours. I got to a point where I can go down pretty quickly and just pop everything off. You go a little faster, you might not get as clean of a cut. Sometimes you have to go back and clean it up a little bit. But I would say I could probably do a side in 30, 45 minutes now. If the wood is green, if it's got moisture in it, it cuts more easily. If it's rock hard, it's more difficult. And that has, the analogy that I always use, the science is, it's a wood science person explained it to me, I put that in the book. I always use the analogy of a steak. So if you cook a steak, it's nice and juicy in the middle, it cuts really easily, you can chew it really easily. If you overcook it till it's shoe leather, it dries out, and then what happens?
Yeah.
It's really hard to cut. So wood works the same way. When the longitudinal cells, cellulose fibers in the tree are swelled up with water, they break apart easier. And they dry out, they get a little bit harder. So that's traditional woodworking, they're often working the wood green. I do some traditional carving, and you can tell the difference if the wood is fresh and has some moisture in it, it'll cut smoothly. It's not that you can't cut it when it's hard, it's just everything's a little bit trickier. So that's a factor too. So the right seasoning of the log is good. The challenge of that is when a wood has moisture in it, what happens when it dries? It can move, it can twist, it can warp. So you're looking for trees that have relatively straight, don't have a lot of twist in the grain, centered pith, something that can grow. A tree grows on a hill. Trees are pretty amazing. They'll build up additional layers to support themselves. That creates tension and compression in the wood. Sometimes you run a piece of wood through a sod, it pops because there's all this tension built up in it because it's been growing at a weird angle. Or you'll see the pith, the center, the little hole dot in the center of the tree, it's off-centered because it was literally building up more material here and less here to support itself. Trees are pretty amazing. So, there it is. So I studied the English tying joint on books, illustrations, surviving joinery, kind of had some basics from Michael and figured out how to cut that. Then recruited some friends, a couple friends that I had met when I got into this. So we start the process of piecing this back together. You can see the scallop marks in it, so they use double bevel hewing axe in this period, so they got big scoops. You get later into the 19th century, they use single bevel, and they generally tend to be straighter. Sometimes they clean them up with an adze, so you see lots of little adze marks in there. But this one, predominantly double beveled, big scallop marks in there. Reasonably good. So you've got good scallop marks there, and then you don't have to replace all the wood. You can cut, they're called scarf joints, so essentially overlapping joinery that kind of fingers the wood together. So that's an example of, that's the tie beam going in, the dovetail joint, maintain the dovetail joint. So there's a series of dropping the piece in and seeing if it fits and having to pop it back out and shave it off and you get it till it fits reasonably well. And then you peg it together and you're off and running. So that's the woodworking chapter. So here's the structure. I'll come back to House Restored for a minute, the book. So the book, again, it's memoirs. There's a little bit of my childhood and growing up, being out and building things in the woods. I grew up in Vermont, building things in the woods and kind of connecting why I would do this work, because I used to, it's really just doing that kind of thing on a larger scale, getting together with friends, working with simple, minimally processed materials, and building stuff. There's also a bit of history, there's a little smidge of science, and then there's a little bit of just my own philosophies on preservation and why I think it matters. So the hope was to give people a little bit for everything, and hopefully that'll make it a more engaging read. But the book structure itself is based on 6 materials. So these are the 6 materials that I've looked at as what you would need to build a house of that period. So it's wood, lime, iron, stone, brick, and glass. And each chapter is dedicated to one material, and each chapter is structured the same way. So I'll go over my overconfident self. I can do this. I'll get into the project. I'll realize, oh no, this is going to be a nightmare. I go off and find someone that's been doing this kind of restoration work much longer than I have. They're all pretty eccentric characters, as you can imagine. I learn from them. I do a little history or science rabbit hole, talk a little bit about the material. I come back, I fix said problem, and just when everything looks great, something goes wrong, leads us to the next material. So that's the structure of the book. If there's one big difference and I don't, again, might be preaching to the choir here, maybe you know all this, but the biggest difference between how an old building is built and a new building is built, it relates to permeability. So let's talk about old houses breathe. So when you're dealing with these materials, stone and brick, they're things that are low fired, they're porous, they're permeable, they soak up moisture. That's okay. It can get pretty clammy in a house if you don't have a dehumidifier on, but you've got water coming up from the basement. When it rains, wood, stone, brick, it's soaking up all this water, but then the sun comes out and it has a path back out and it dries out and it evaporates, and as long as the moisture doesn't get trapped and you're dealing with good materials, a properly maintained structure can last for thousands of years. The oldest timber frame structure, wood frame structure, I think is in Tibet. It's in the book. I think it's like 7th century. It's still standing. You go to England or France, you go to Europe and you see stuff that's been around for the 1500s. Wood frame buildings. Now better quality lumber, durable way to build, permeable materials. Today we don't build that way anymore. We like moisture barriers. So we stick frame houses. Now we're seeing concrete 3D printed houses. That's kind of interesting. And in a world where we have affordable housing issues, I'm all for that. I'm fine with that. Sometimes cheaper and faster is the way. But I still think there are things that we can learn from these. Newer is not always better. These old houses still have things to teach us. So one of the big problems I see, so today we like to put moisture barriers on everything. Let's put the ice and water shield, rubber membranes on things. Let's seal this thing up so it's watertight. And that works great as long as that moisture barrier doesn't fail. There are 2 problems I see. One, if it fails and water starts getting into places, now it can't get out. It's trapped, and then it accelerates the rot decomposition. The other issue I see is when people take modern day methods and they start mixing them with traditional methods, and they start putting big moisture barriers on these old houses, because you could put your ice and water shield or whatever vinyl siding, whatever you're going to put on the outside. If you don't have this completely sealed up and you're getting water coming from underground, it's going to get trapped, and again you have a risk of accelerating the decomposition. One of the examples of that I see a lot. So old bricks were fired at pretty low temperatures. They're fairly soft, and the mortar was made of burned seashells or burned limestone. It was lime plaster and sand and horsehair if it was a render or a parge. But you want your mortar to be softer than your brick. So if the structure is moving or settling, you want the mortar to fail first. You don't want the brick to fail. And the other thing is, when it rains, the brick's going to soak up, both the brick and mortar are going to soak up the moisture. When the sun comes back out, you want it to wick back out through the mortar. You don't want the water trapped in the brick. So that's why these old mortars are softer and more permeable. The problem I see a lot when people repoint old brick is they use modern day Portland cement. It's high fired, it's hard, it's dense, and what you're doing, essentially you're plugging up this exit pathway for moisture. So the brick soaks up the water, and now the water can't just evaporate out through the mortar, it gets trapped in the brick. This could be a problem depending on what time of year it is. If it's late fall or early spring and you have freeze-thaw cycles, you got water trapped in your brick. If it freezes, what's water do when it freezes? And what happens if it's trapped in old, soft brick? Pops big faces of the brick off, so it starts spalling. So that's, fortunately, traditional masonry, the guilds and those kinds of systems were much more intact over in older places in Northern Europe. A lot of that knowledge got lost with the modern industrialization here, but there are people kind of Ted Benson is a well-known timber framer, said reconnecting the thread was cut the way he described it, and I always like that terminology. So people like me are kind of finding this stuff out that think there's a value to saving these buildings, and we're figuring out the better ways to preserve them that even people weren't thinking about in the 70s or 80s. How much do I have a little more time? You want to hear a little more than anything else? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, this is fascinating.
Okay. I'll just share, this is just kind of an interesting story I put in here too, philosophically. And again, history, the philosophy of it, the actual technical side of it, storytelling, whatever you want, I'm glad to give it to you and answer questions. But I'll end my prepared comments on a more philosophical note. That's all right. Okay.
Nice.
Does anyone know what this is? Tell me.
Tibetan sand painting.
Mandalas, I believe they call, listen, I'm not an expert in this area. I think they're mandalas they call them.
But it's spelled sand. Yeah.
Okay.
Just sand.
So who's seen, a bunch of people have seen this before. So what do they do?
They put it all together and then it
And then yeah. So I saw this once. I was still in the financial service world. I had a meeting canceled. I had some time to kill, and there was an open house at this building next to this coffee shop I was at, just grabbing a coffee and killing some time. And I just poked my head in, and here's the monks, and they draw out this intricate geometric pattern. And I don't know, my understanding it's either represents some kind of deity or the universe. Again, I'm not a religious historian, I don't fully understand that. But they spend, hours on end with this colored sand in these little funnels, and they're just tapping, and they bring these designs to life in this kind of flat, sand painting, for lack of a better term. And you go and you watch them, and it's really interesting. And then when they're done, as was pointed out, they sweep this stuff off the board and they go dump it in the river. And they just endlessly do this. And philosophically, well, why do they do this? Do you remember?
it's a sign of devotion, partly, and it's a way of getting closer to the deity.
So
And
my
it's
understanding.
a monastic practice.
Yeah, so my understanding is part of it is kind of accepting the impermanence of all things. Like
Yeah.
when you get attached to something, if you lose it, it's really painful, right? And so it's to kind of avoid attachment, is kind of accept that's the situation we get. We come here, none of us are going to be here forever. These buildings that we're trying to say on a long enough timeline, it's all gone. I was so fast, I've thought so much about this. The book opens up with this story, so if you start reading it, what the heck's this guy talking about? It'll make sense, don't worry. I was fascinated by this because somewhere along the line, as I had gotten pretty far down the historic preservation rabbit hole, I remembered seeing these monks doing this, and this thought popped in my head, like, what am I doing? I'm doing the complete opposite of that. When I make something, when I build something, I want it to last forever. I want a legacy. I like that legacy. It's going to be here when I'm gone. I like that. I don't know. That's appealing to me. These old buildings, a developer wants to come in and knock it down. You can't do that. It's going to ruin our town as this quaint charm and character. We don't want to lose the so-and-so meeting house. So there's this great question. So this goes in the face of just kind of letting go of stuff. And everyone here probably feels there's a value to save it, right? So what I wanted to kind of explore, we all have a rhyme or reason, what I wanted to explore was, well, why? Well, why? Why does it matter? And I won't give you too much away, but that's really, in addition to kind of the history of the memoir part of this, it's really an exploration of why does doing this matter at all? I'm just giving you my take. Everyone brings their own answer to that question. I'm just giving you my take on it. But there was a quote, so I won't give too much away there, but that's really what the story is about. What's the point of any of this? There's a quote I found, she's not any big name person, she's a professor at a small community college out in Colorado. I stumbled across some white article that this woman had written, Karen Waller. I ended up tracking her down, called her, had an hour-long phone conversation with her. It was fascinating. But she had this great quote. She wrote this article after she had a house that had burned down. And she wrote this article about kind of this attachment to this house. And there's this quote, and I opened up my first chapter with it. My house is not just a thing, it's an extension of my physical body, my sense of self that reflects who I was and want to be. And I think there's something interesting about the clothes we wear, what we put on, how we comb our hair in the morning, what car we drive, what house we live in, like what it looks like inside. These things are, if you want to get philosophical, they're reflections of who we are, right? The things we own are extensions of the self. And in a weird way, what I came to realize is, this kind of old, quirky, unique, interesting, sort of naturally, I call it an environmentalist because they're materials that naturally biodegrade. This old house it's in ways I projected a little bit of myself onto it. It's a little bit of reflection, I think, of who I am and what drew me to it. And again, everyone has their own answer to that. But I thought that's just a really interesting philosophical way to look at the house. So it's really an exploration of why does saving these things matter? And I have lots of other reasons. I just think they make our old architecture, makes our communities, our towns more interesting. The most visited place in the world is Paris, if you ever Google that. And people go there for interesting artwork, interesting architecture, good food, things that you kind of create this unique, interesting culture. I think a lot of people understand that that's a beautiful place to go. They don't always think a little further down the line, well, why am I drawn to that place? So that was the question for me. I'm drawn to old architecture, but why is that? So I explore that. So that's really what the story is. So I'm going to close there. I'm going to close by saying this. I'm preaching to the choir, I know. It sounds like everyone here appreciates preserving historic architecture. Here's what I need from you. Here's what I'm asking. A lot of these kind of books that come out are written, they're local histories, they're written by local historians. I went into this with a different purpose. This is not specific to Pembroke or even the person that built the house or the people that live in that house. This is just general to these kind of bigger picture themes that I just mentioned. And the reason that I wrote the story that way is because in my mind, that's the best way to have something that might have a broader appeal. If I just wrote a local history about Pembroke, if you don't live in Pembroke, you probably don't care that much about it. So this book was intended to touch on some bigger picture themes in hopes that it would be more interesting to a broader number of people. And I'll come full circle on what I said from the beginning. Why do I want to get more people interested in this? Because the more people that get behind this stuff, the more people we can educate and see the value. That's how we generate support, that's how we generate funding, and that's how we save more buildings. A lot of people I work with in preservation, they didn't get into it for money, but the reality of it is, it's another tool in the toolbox. We need it to save these things. We need money and we need support from the people in our towns. What I need you to do, I would encourage you to do, I can't make you, but buy a copy of the book, like my pitch here. It's the finance guy, and he's still there. Buy a copy of the book. If you don't like it, it makes great kindling for your old hearth. Just tear those pages up, you start your fire, it'll be a nice cozy night, pour your wine, it'll be great. If you do like it, tell people that you know, share it, tell people they need to find it, they need to buy this, spread the word. We've got something that's got national, it's got the ability to have kind of a national appeal. I'm working this as best I can. So hopefully there's going to be an article in the Boston Globe coming up, a piece in the New York Times coming out. I just talked to the editor of Yankee magazine. I'm trying to get the word out, and that's what we need. We also need younger people. No offense, I go to a lot of meetings. I see an older demographic. We need to get younger generations involved in this as well, or it all dies with us. So I'm not young, but I'm middle-aged now. But I'm generally younger than my audiences that I'm presenting to. This is going to help bridge that gap, though, I'm hoping. So that's my spiel. I did not come up with the price. It's $25, cash, check, or you can find it on all major retailers, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. So I'll stop there. And do we have time for questions?
Sure.
Or is that good?
Yeah. So questions?
Any?
It's not, well, it's a comment and a question. In relation to what you just said, we sure need younger tradesmen. That's the thing that is my big thing.
Yeah.
And the other question I had is, in the, where your gunstock post was dust, was that caused by just age or termites or?
So it had evidence of significant powder post beetle damage.
Oh.
So my guess is somewhere along the way somebody just let the roof go, and it was just getting saturated, and it became a nice little home for bugs.
So they're attracted to moisture?
Yeah.
Oh.
Carpenter ants, termites, powder post beetle, you have dry rot. different fungus. So they used to use, that was pine. They used to use white oak. White oak is naturally more rot resistant, so why it was used for shipbuilding and framing. There is, it's a little long-winded, but I'm going to run with it. If you ever look at a cross-section of white oak, if you look at the pores, there's a natural cell growth called tyloses. If you look at it under a microscope, the pores of the wood look like they're filled in with kind of a clear resin. It's just the way that tree grows, but it keeps moisture from getting soaked up, and that keeps it from being a great habitat for microorganisms that eat wood. So that's why white oak, black locust is another one. That's why if you ever go to a shipbuilding museum, that's the stuff they use for shipbuilding. They prefer it for house framing. Fortunately, what do? We have a nice, good material like that. We cut all the trees down. Oak's a much
Was
slow,
cedar ever used?
slow
or
growing
is
tree.
that-
Usually for shingles and stuff, but for framing, I see white oak was preferred. I saw a chestnut frame on an 18th century house that held up, one of the most well-preserved frames I've ever seen. I couldn't recognize it. My wood identification is so-so. I was told it was chestnut. It was a hardwood. It was not oak. Of course, there was a blight that wiped out all the chestnut. But that apparently was used, and then a lot of, in New England, it's usually oak or pine, white oak or pine is preferred. But pine is much less rot resistant than white oak. But it grows slow, so we cut it all down, and it didn't. This is another advantage of building things to last, going against our Buddhist monks. If something lasts a long time, the materials used to build it have time to reproduce, to regenerate, to replace themselves. So if my house lasts 1,000 years and I have some oak trees in the backyard, they're going to have time to grow, and a builder down the line could use that again. If I'm building the house that gets demolished in 100 years and this kind of disposable, a lot of things are moving that direction, right? Housing moves that direction too. If that trend continues, well, we just throw more stuff in the dumpster. Again, advantages to cheap and faster, but there are costs and consequences.
So you were hewing your beams green wood.
Yeah, that had moisture.
But did you use them immediately, or did you let them dry out for
So
a year or two?
So that is something that I continuously, kind of the mad scientist with that. So I use them immediately, and then you can see they will shrink in time. There's a little Dutchman, a little patch I put in the bottom one of the beams, and I spent all this time getting it nice and perfect, and then came back a year later, and it was an inch narrower.
Yeah, you get very upset when they sell you green wood.
Yeah.
Every year.
Yeah, and then most people don't want that.
But you knew that. You knew that.
Yeah, so I knew that. So it's better practice to build the whole thing out of green wood, and then it all moves and shrinks down together. When you start mixing wood that's been drying for 200-300 years with this new wood, you can consider that. But I know I've seen lots of old repairs, repairs that were done in the 1800s on the 1700s house, and you see some wonky stuff done, or things have moved, or it's really a tolerance question. I know builders that are really fussy about that stuff, and when I look at the older structures, I sort of see where their builders were fussy and where they let things go. And my tolerance is, I get really fussy about some things, and other things I let go.
I guess if you were building a house back then, you're not going to wait a year or two to use the wood. You just wanted to get the house built.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a good question, because what I read, trying to think of what account that was, it would take them a year to cut down the trees and do all the joinery. I'm assuming just over time, and I almost wonder if some of the wood in the house was seasoned more than other parts of it. I don't know. There was an addition done. So this house was, the early 18th century part was a single story, and then there's 3 different styles of timber framing in the house that we live in. There's 4 actually, but 3 in the oldest part of the house, the 18th century part of the house. My theory is they moved another house next to it and then did an addition on top of that. And they put in this upstairs level, they put in another sill and just pegged it down onto the wall plate of the frame below it. And then they put the post on top of that. And you can see the post shrank this way and the sill shrank this way. So at the bottom of all the posts, there's an inch gap. You can just see where the wood shrank. So they used green. That wood didn't season at all. And again, that might drive somebody crazy, but you look at all these old, you see stuff like that. So I don't get too bent out of shape about it. Yeah.
So what happened with the whole theory about insulation and making your house more efficient, energy efficient by adding insulation? is that something you have a theory about old houses and insulation?
Yeah, so it's one of those, that's a big driver, you know, you get the Anderson and Pella things that throw these windows away, and this is where it's, you know, I can make my case for sustainability of building in a way that things last, but then the other side of that is if your house is old and drafty and inefficient, how much energy are we using to heat and cool, and what kind of waste. So you can sort of, none of these issues are cut and dry. There's lots of different things to factor. So some of these really, really early houses, so in between the frames, they stack brick, brick infill, so they called it nogging. So the bricks that, these bricks were fired in wood-fired kilns, crude stove kilns, and when you're firing with that kind of technology, you're not getting a nice consistent firing like we get today with the industrial machinery. So some bricks get overcooked, some bricks are undercooked, and some are kind of perfect. It's like Goldilocks in the porridge, right? So the undercooked bricks, they call them salmon bricks because they tend to be salmon in color, lighter in color. So they wouldn't put those for the top of a chimney stack because they would deteriorate faster, they were soft. So they would just take those and they would use them for wall infill. So some of these timber frame houses have thick brick nogging for insulation, and they insulate quite well. Drafty windows, you know, that's a constant battle.
So if you find bricks, it could be for insulation?
Could be for, it might be insulation in there, like I was talking to somebody about the James Blake house, that's got wattle and, we were talking about that, right? Wattle and daub. But sometimes they're just hollow cavity wall, it's just studs and then lath and plaster over it, and there's sheathing and there's a hollow gap. You know, our house, somebody blew insulation in there. It certainly, in the attic, it works well. If you get moisture in there, though, then it gets moldy really quick. You kind of lose the breathability. So you're always kind of, yeah, you're always, every project, you kind of look at it and you kind of think about, at least I do, you think about all these things and you try to make the best decision you can in the moment. Sometimes you do it, sometimes you don't.
I lived in a house in Glen Cove, had post and beam, and we found bricks in the wall.
Yeah.
But they only went up to wainscot height, or maybe a little higher.
Okay.
Probably leftover bricks or something. But of course, the historians in that place and at that time told us it was to stop the bullets and the arrows.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this is the first time I've heard another.
Yeah. Well, so I've heard. I mean,
That's great.
this is the other. So I go to old house museums usually when I get a chance, and I tour and I try to push docents and people to let me poke around attics and basements and all that. And you hear all kinds of stuff. And then you start reading about this stuff, and the more and more you learn, then you sort of go back to this thing, and that's not true at all. But when I was younger and said something to prove, I'd be this snotty. No, you're wrong. It's right. And now that I'm older, I don't correct anybody. Okay, I shake my head politely and leave, and then they're totally wrong, but I don't care. They're telling tours and tours of people with infactual, not factual information. Why do I ruin someone's day? I don't care. One of the things I hear a lot is there'll be scratch scribe marks in the frames. You go to Salem and, this was to ward off witches. And then when you learn a little bit about timber framing, it's like, oh no, that X is just, they were just marking where they're going to put mortise. You see the X, it's like, no, that's not. So they would put shoes over the door frames, and there was some of that kind of superstitious stuff. Builders that I know have found shoes and things over door frames. I think that's a common one, but I've been told that markings are to ward off witches. There were in the house that we live in, there were these, in this second story, there were these little pieces of wood, and you lifted them up and there was a little hole, a notch in the frame underneath. And we were told that was to hide documents during the Revolutionary War. And I looked at it, and it was a mortise pocket for a rafter. So because it was a single story, and then they did an addition on top of it, it had all these mortise pockets back to the English time joint with a rafter tenon in. So you could see the hole where the peg was drilled through, and it was a really nice 1.5-inch rectangular slot. It was a rafter pocket. And I said, there's one there, I bet there's going to be one down there, and one over there, and sure enough, right down the line. So people, I'm torn. Again, when I was younger, it used to be, you're wrong, this is right, we have to be historically accurate. Stories get people, if it gets people excited about it, who might have burst their bubble? That was the woman that lived in the house for 40 years before we bought it. I'm not going to tell her that, no, actually, that's a mortise pocket. Wonderful, they hit stuff for the Revolution, great. I'll buy the house.
You think most did you ever finish the kitchen?
wonderful
Let
question.
alone the house.
Okay.
There's a hole in the ceiling.
I know. The other final note on what the story is, without giving too much away. So, I didn't have a background writing, so I just started writing and thought, oh, maybe I'll just self-publish thing. I just want to write
This is easy, I can do this.
Yeah, so I just want to do this. And then, like the preservation stuff, I just go deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. And then it's like, wait a minute, why would I pay to self-publish? You can get paid to write. Well, how do we do that? Well, you get an agent. Well, how do I get an agent? So this was a long process. And this is where I was going with that. So early drafts of this manuscript were getting rejected, and so I was like, how do I write a good story? And I started sort of figuring out techniques that fiction writers use, and then not using the real story, but just borrowing techniques. One of them is, and this is true, there's a countdown to get this house ready to host a Thanksgiving dinner, which is true. And every part of this, I mean, literally the night before, 24 people are coming over the house. It's like I'm like twisting wires up in the attic, and there's just a mad scramble to get power back in the kitchen. That all happened. So anyway, every chapter, at the end of each chapter, it's like I had 5 more months to get this thing ready. There's this the ticking clock is counting down, hopefully to create a little tension in the story. But there was a mad scramble to get that kitchen ready for this date. So the framing was really meticulous and methodical. The rest of slapping that kitchen together was hasty and like just get it together. I've since done a little more cosmetic work on there. That thing needs more framing. I mean, it's endless. But it looks presentable now. There's no hole anymore.
Dinner got cooked.
Dinner got cooked. We succeeded.
Wow.
Did you have a question?
Well, I was curious, do you think a large proportion of the early houses were one story originally and then got added?
It probably depends on how much money they.
Right.
There's I think of the because there's this perception that all these houses were really low too, and that's another thing you hear. You hear, oh well, people were a lot shorter back then, and then you read, it's like they were a few inches, an inch or two shorter, but not really.
They weren't midgets.
Yeah, they weren't midgets. They weren't really that much shorter. It was just more efficient heating-wise to and use less materials to have a low. That's why. And then. So there's a house, I've seen a few of these, but there's the Edward Winslow house in Marshfield, and that was built by Edward Winslow was one of the pilgrims on the Mayflower. No, sorry, it's not Edward Winslow, it's like his grandson or something. Is it Isaac Winslow? I think it's Isaac Winslow, don't quote me on that. Anyway, it's $16.99, and you go in that house, and so it's a big timber frame thing like this, and you go in that house, and the ceilings are really high. And it's like, whoa, that's higher than a modern house built today, and that's just because the great grandson Edward Winslow had wealth, probably just
Showing off.
just showing off. So single story, 2-story, I think that all depends on who built it and what kind of money did they have. Loring was doing pretty well for himself back then, but started with just a pretty crude single story with a hall and parlor, and then as generations went on, addition and raised it up and held off the back. Which is what we do to houses today.
Yeah, the Simeon Strong house was a salt box at one time.
Yeah, right. The salt. You see that. That
Kept getting higher.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll go up. I go up in attics, and you'll see where the original rafters are. They built, on one side they build a second set of rafters off it. They kind of expand the footprint that way. You see all sorts of funky stuff on these things.
Oh, that's why you could dash over Plymouth.
Yeah.
Actually, if you go to the Flavors, their barn, where they have seating inside, that's an exposed timber frame construction, new,
Yeah.
but you can really admire it.
Yeah, there's been a big timber frame revival. You're seeing new timber, and I never got that far into. I do little repair stuff, but tons of companies now are building all new timber frames. You see that everywhere, and that was there were a lot of people back to land movement that got into this. Ted Benson, he's still around, he's up in Walpole, New Hampshire. He built a house for Ken Burns, or not a house, but I think what Ken Burns uses as a studio for editing. Benson wrote that. The first book I ever got on timber frame was written by Ted Benson. It's called Building the Timber Frame House, published in the early 80s. So there were a handful of people that led the revival of this stuff, and it really has taken off. There's much more demand now.
Well, thank you
All
very
right,
much.
thank you.